Hello, my name is Sarami, and today we're sewing the Glover Jean Jacket by Cashmerette. The Glover Jean Jacket is part of the Cashmerette Club membership program. You can find a link in the description if you want to learn more about the Cashmerette Club membership program. The Glover Jean Jacket is a classic jean jacket with all the usual features: chest pockets with flaps, roomy welted hand pockets with cuffs, yoke, and adjustable side tabs. The Glover Jean Jacket takes 8 to 11 ounce non-stretch denim or a fabric of a comparable weight. Today I'm going to be using a linen cotton blend, and I'm going to be flatlining my pieces to give them some extra weight. So this will be the right side of my fabric, and sometimes you're going to see the back of the fabric, which is the wrong side, or this extra layer of fabric, and that will also be considered the wrong side. We're going to be using a heavier weight needle since we're going to have lots of layers today. We recommend a jeans or denim needle, especially if you're sewing something like denim. And you'll also need some other notions to complete your jean jacket. For my Glover Jean Jacket, I'm going to be using a contrast thread to help you be able to see what I'm doing. All seam allowances are 1/2 inch unless I tell you otherwise. For the top stitching today, we're going to use a length of 3 to 4 millimeters, and we're going to first start 1/8 of an inch or 3 millimeters from the edge, and then our second row will be a 1/4 inch away or 6 millimeters. I'll remind you of some of these details along the way. There's going to be quite a few seams that we're going to sew, finish, and top stitch 2 rows of top stitching. So I thought I'd give you a little overview on a few options. So if this was the seam that we're sewing together right here, and we place this right sides together, we're always lining it up here at the 1/2 inch away, because that's our seam allowance from this raw edge. So we always want the end down here to touch. Where whatever this angle is, you want these two to intersect a 1/2 inch away from this raw edge. Then we're going to sew our seam 1/2 inch, and our stitch length is 2.5. Now, there's a few ways we can finish this raw edge. You could use a serger, you can zigzag, and you could also just put a second row of stitching right next to the first one and then trim it down close to that edge, just like this. Then we press our seam from the wrong side first, make sure it looks good from the right side, and then we add our top stitching. Our first row is going to be 1/8 of an inch away from our seam, or about 3 millimeters, and our stitch length is going to be between 3 and 4. If you use a top stitching thread, make sure you use a regular weight thread in your bobbin. It'll be a lot easier to get your tension correct. All right, now that our second row will be 1/4 of an inch or 6 millimeters away from our first row, just like this. Throughout this video, you're going to see me sew my seam and sometimes overlock it and then do my top stitch. In other seams, I'm going to use my cover stitch, but I'm going to first sew my seam using all the same things that we talked about. And then I'm going to trim my seam down, press it, and then I'll use a machine called a cover stitch to do my double needle top stitch. This is going to finish my raw edge and also put 2 rows of perfectly spaced stitches. Now, if you want to try this, if you have a cover stitch and you just want to be able to use it a little bit more, you're not going to be able to use this on all of your top stitching, mainly because the underside isn't very attractive for things like pocket flaps, and you also cannot turn corners. You can do gentle curves, but that's about it. So there are some limitations to this. So when I do this, I have found that if I go right up to where I'm starting and then start sewing. Now, this also will be dependent upon if your machine can go through thicknesses very well. And I don't mean like an even thickness, I mean changing thicknesses. This machine particularly does an okay job with that, but I do go a little slow when I'm doing things like coming across an intersection where a pocket flap is in the seam. Now, the other really big limitation for some cover stitches is the throat space, which is right here. Now, I have a very narrow throat space right here. It does make some pieces kind of difficult to squeeze through here, so you want to be strategic when you start your sewing. And feed it through the machine where the smallest part of the garment is going to be having to go through this little space. So here's how this looks. I used a contrast thread on the top from the back, And this is how the back looks. So you can see that it's flush, the edge is finished, and I got my 2 rows of top stitching. However you decide to finish your Glover jean jacket, it's gonna be great, and you might find that using a few different methods will get the job done. Our first step is to interface all of our pieces. So we have the pocket welt, both of those get interfaced. 2 of our pocket flaps and the upper or top collar also gets interfaced. For both the sleeve cuff and the front waistband, we're going to cut that interfacing in half along the length of it and fuse it to our cut pieces. We also have the yoke here that we have an interfacing piece for, our center front along the placket opening here, the top of our pocket, and our back band. All right, we're gonna start with our chest pocket. I finished my bottom edge here. Now we're gonna go to the iron and we're gonna press some of these edges under. We're gonna press this bottom edge right here, 1/2 inch up. We're gonna press this top edge under 5/8 of an inch. And again along the notch. We're going to double needle top stitch the hem, and I'm going to do so from the right side so that my stitching looks its nicest from that side. We're going to space the stitches 1/4 inch apart. Let's attach our chest pockets to the middle front here. We're going to line the pocket up to these notches near the top. I'm going to secure it to keep it in place. And we're going to add our 2 rows of top stitch right here at the bottom edge. We're going to baste along the sides. And now our pocket is attached, and we'll repeat with the other pocket and middle front. If your fabric is on the light side or you feel like it might fray a little bit, it's recommended to interface the opening, and you're going to want a piece that's 1 3/8 inch wide by 6 3/4 of an inch. And you're going to center that over the opening on the side front and fuse it. Next, we're going to sew our welt pockets, and we're going to do this step by step. Personally, I think the trickiest part about doing a welt pocket is marking the pieces. When you mark the pieces really accurately, you set yourself up for success. And sometimes this can be really tricky because we need to work on the front and the back side of the fabric. I like to cut out a hole in my pattern and start the tracing, but I don't use the template completely. I like to measure the pocket opening and transfer that opening exactly to the pieces. Now, because we're doing a flap on this one, it's going to be really helpful to mark the front and the back of our side front. We're also going to do the pocket lining. My pocket lining is my main fabric, and I'm going to be using 2 layers for my under pocket so that the inside will match. The other marking we're going to want is the center of this pocket opening on your side front, so we know exactly where to line up our flap. You can see here is my pocket opening here, and here is my center line. Now, another little marking that might be helpful for you is to mark a stop about 3/8 of an inch away, or 1 centimeter from the end of this pocket opening. All right, we're going to take our welt and we're going to fold it wrong sides together and give it a good press. Now, the last line you can mark optionally is a sew line on this flap so that you can stay exactly 3/8 of an inch or 1 centimeter away from this raw edge. And when we sew this flap to this opening, we're not going to go all the way to the end. We're going to stop 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch away from this end, and that's why we put this extra little mark at the center there. All right, I've retraced my box so you can see it really clearly since this fabric is a little busy. So we have our outer perimeter box here, and then we draw a line straight down the middle. Now this little line here is part of the design of the fabric, but you can see here I have this little mark here, and that is 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch away from the end of our pocket opening. This is where we're going to stop sewing just for the flap when we attach it. The last little line I did was on the welt itself. This is optional, and I drew a line that's 3/8 of an inch away from this raw edge here along here, and then I transferred those end marks, you can kind of see right there, by just centering this welt over the length of this opening, and then just transferring it here so that I am in the right spot. This way we're really clear where our sew line is when we attach this first bit. All right, which it's time to do now. So we're going to line up our welt, and we're going to put the raw edge to this center line that we drew, and we're going to center it over the opening, just like this. We're going to sew 3/8 of an inch away from the center line down the pocket opening, and we're going to stop 3/8 of an inch away from the end. We have to do that, otherwise we can't turn the flap inside the pocket. So we're going to start right here. Here's the center line right here. Here's this 3/8 of an inch away from the end of the pocket opening here and here. So here's my 3/8, here's my 3/8. So we're going to start and stop here. We're using a regular stitch length. I like to do my pocket opening a little bit less than the regular stitch length if my fabric frays a little bit. And you will back stitch. So we have our stitch line here, right down that line there. All right, once we've attached our flap, and you can see here, I've adjusted my box to make sure that it's still a 3/4 inch parallel line to my sew line here. We're going to lay our pocket with our box. You can see my box kind of faintly there. And we're going to center this best we can and line up our box to the one that's on the side front. And I will pin around the perimeter here because we're going to sew from the other side using our original stitch line as a guide. We just want to keep our pins out of the way when we sew. So now we're going to sew 2 parallel lines. So we're going to do the full length of our box. So we're going to go from end to end, and we're going to go just to the right of our stitch line here, so we include that in the inside of the box. And then our other lines are going to go from here to here, so we're not sewing across the ends. And this is when I like to decrease my stitch length just a touch if my fabric frays. This is when we're most trying to get that 3/4 of an inch parallel line. We have our 2 parallel rows. You can look on this side as well. And now it's time to cut. So we're going to cut down the center and then in a Y shape pointing at these 2 corners where we stopped our stitching. So I like to do this layer by layer, so I'll get it going and then pick it up. You don't need to cut that flap we already sewed. We're just focused on the side front and the pocket. So I'll stop and then go at an angle toward that stitch. All right, so here we have our cut, top and bottom. And now we're gonna flip this through the hole, and we're gonna do some pressing. Now this is also where we're going to pull the flap through the end here, where the triangles are. So just grab that kind of gently and pull it through. And same with this end here. There we go. All right, so let's go to the iron. And first I'm just gonna press that seam there just to flatten it out. It'll behave a lot nicer if I sort of prime it a little bit. Pull this seam apart here just to kind of get it going. I try not to pull on anything too hard at this point. We don't want our corners to fray, and we're just trying to see what's going on at first. It'll always feel like it's not going well, and then it just all comes together. So just be patient, kind of look at each thing and press it. We'll press this edge. This is the top of the pocket where the flap is not sewn right there. And then I usually lift up these corners here, and I'll sort of look what's going on and straighten out these little triangles a little bit. Give the corner a little tug on the side front and on the pocket. Same with this side, on the outer side. My pocket markings are a little off, so it makes it look a little worse than it is. Just like that. Okay, this is looking pretty good. I try and squeeze the pocket a little bit closed like this. I don't want it to get distorted before I've ironed it all and sewn it into place. Pull this corner a little bit. All right, we're ready for our next step. So now we're going to pick up these ends here of our side front. You can see here's my side front, here's my pocket. We're going to pick this up and we're going to sew across this little triangle here. So I like to spend a second and make sure that I'm going to sew in a straight line across that opening. So I kind of give it a good look. And I don't go all the way across. I like to stop right before that little end of the cut. So just keeping all of the sewing on the triangle. Just like this. You're going to repeat for the other triangle, and then we're going to top stitch just the bottom edge here of the pocket opening, because we'll do the other 3 sides when we have our under pocket on. So when I top stitch this bottom edge here, I like to go 1 stitch past the end here, so that way when I do my other 3 sides, they'll link up and make a square or a rectangle. So we'll start 1 stitch past the end here. And you put it on your top stitch thread and your top stitch length. And then 1 stitch past there. There we go. All right, so now it's time for our under pocket here, and you can see I'm flatlining mine. So you can line up your pocket so that all the edges line up. And you can sew them together around the perimeter and then finish the edge. So now I would like a clean finish on the inside of my garment. So on these 2 edges here, I'm going to sew them right sides together so that I get that. So it's just on these 2 edges I'm going to sew this. So this is my chosen seam finish. So kind of a mock French seam. So I'm just going to sew at a 1/4 inch seam first. Turn my corner here. So this would be wrong sides together. I'll clip this little corner here, and then now I can flip it right side out. I'll turn this corner right here, and you can see that I have these 2 clean edges right here. I'm going to press those. And then I'm just going to enclose that 1/4 inch seam that I just sewed. We're close. Taking care not to catch anything else. There we go. And now I can sew these 2 remaining edges together and finish them however I want. They're both going to be enclosed in the other seams that are to come, the band and the placket. So here we have my finished pocket inside and on the outside. So now we can top stitch our opening, and I can connect with that little extra stitch that I put on the underside. And this is where sometimes I'll shape the pocket, make it look a little better maybe than it is. I can sort of close any gaps, because I've got kind of a gap at one end there. It won't fix everything, but it'll help a little bit. There we go. All right, and if you would like to put a bar tack along each end here as an additional reinforcement and to give it that really great jean jacket look, go for it. All right, our next step is we're going to sew our mid front to our side front, and then we're going to top stitch this. We're going to finish the edge and top stitch. And this is one case where I'm going to be using my cover stitch machine to do the double needle top stitch, because it'll also finish the edge there on the back. Well, the first thing we want to do is pin this pocket of the side front out of the way so we can get access to this seam here. So I'm just going to pin this, and we're going to place this right sides together. We're going to line it up on the 1/2 inch seam line, and we're going to sew our seam. We have notches all along the way to match to keep us on track. Now you'll want to finish your edge in your chosen method. We're going to press this seam toward the side front, or the one with the pocket, and then we're going to top stitch. And your first row is going to go about 1/8 of an inch or 3 millimeters away from the seam here. And then your second one will be 1/4 inch or 6 millimeters away from that first one. I'm going to cover stitch, so I'm going to trim my seam first, and then I'm going to do all of it at one time. All right, let's repeat this with our center front to our middle front. So we'll place this right sides together, 1/2 inch seam, press and top stitch. Repeat for your other front, and now we're going to baste our pocket layers to the bottom edge. All right, we have our lower fronts all ready to go. All right, time to assemble our flaps. And if you want to use the optional grosgrain ribbon, you're going to cut a piece that's 1 3/8 inch long, and we're going to fold it in half. Now, I'm just going to use a little label that I have that's approximately the same size, and we're going to center it on one of your interfaced pocket flaps. We're going to center it along the right edge, right as if you were wearing it. Find the center, tack it inside the seam allowance. And we're going to sew our pocket flap right sides together, 1/2 inch seam. And on these pocket flaps, I like to find the center of the little angle right here, so I know to pivot my needle right there. Okay, we're going to trim this down half the amount of the seam allowance. All right, let's press. And now we'll top stitch. And you'll repeat for your other flap. It's better to sew your flap together, get it all pressed and turned, and then do your top stitching on both at the same time. If you plan on doing buttons and buttonholes, now is a really good time to put the buttonhole on this little flap because it'll be a lot easier to maneuver under your machine. So what I would recommend doing is finding the center here that lines up to the point. And then I would place my button about 1/4 of an inch away from your top stitching, or about 1/2 inch away from the outer edge, or you can use the marking on the pocket flap pattern piece. So that's about right here, but depending on your button and size, I would do what works best for you. And then we'll mark our button, and then we need to add a little extra length if our button's thick. So you want the buttonhole to be as long plus the thickness of the button, and that's how long your buttonhole would be. So put your buttonhole on, and then we'll do the buttonholes on the other bits later. All right, time to baste our flaps, and I've added snaps to mine. We're going to baste our flaps to this top edge here, and the one with the ribbon will go on your left front as if you're wearing it. So this is my left front, armholes right here. There's my little ribbon tab. All right, let's sew our yoke to our lower front here, and we're going to place it right sides together. We're going to line it up at the 1/2 inch seam line. All right, and we're going to press the seam up toward the yoke. All right, we'll finish the edge, and then we'll do our 2 rows of top stitch. All right, there we have our fronts are done. We're going to assemble our back now. We're going to do very similar to what we did to the front. We're going to sew our side back to our center back, finish the edge, top stitch, and then we're going to attach our yoke to it. So let's get to it. All right, let's make a jacket. We're gonna put our shoulders together, and we're gonna do the same thing we've been doing. Seam, finish, top stitch, and we're pressing our shoulder seam toward the back. All right, let's grab your collars and we're going to sew them together. First thing we're gonna do is we're gonna press this long curved edge up 1/2 inch on your upper collar. We're gonna place this right sides together to our under collar. Now the under collar isn't exactly the same size by design. We just wanna line up our 3 straight edges. We're going to sew them at a 1/2 inch seam. So don't worry about it not lining up, just sort of pull it over to the edge to get it exactly along the raw edges there. Now if your seam allowances are particularly thick, you're going to want to grade the seam allowances or trim them down as necessary, and we're going to trim our corners as well. All right, so we'll turn our collar right side out. And now let's press. Now when I first start pressing a collar, I just press the seam here, just to kind of get it ready. It'll lay a lot flatter if I do that. And now on the under collar, we want to make sure that none of it shows on the right side. So right now we're looking at the underside of the collar. So I'll make sure that I can see a little bit of my top collar there. And you can sort of look and see like, okay, would that line up there? You know, make sure that you're going just a little past that edge there. And same with these short ends. I reach in and I pull the under collar so that only the top collar is showing at the ends there. And then when I look on the other side, I can see just this little sliver of the top collar showing all along the edge there. All right, let's give it one final press now that we know we have all our edges exactly how we want them. And now we'll top stitch our top collar, and we're gonna go all the way to the raw edge. So in other words, we're gonna start at the neck edge, go all the way around, right through this folded edge here. All right, let's attach our collar. So I like to start at the center back here and line up the notch. All right, so the first place I like to start is at the center back neck. So right there at the center of the yoke. And if you don't have that notch, you can just fold it in half and find the center there. All right, so once I have the center back neck pinned, There's a notch right here behind the shoulder seam and a notch on the collar. And then when we have one here at the center front, and there's 2 notches here, we're gonna go for the one that's closer or more closer to the shoulder seam. And then we'll repeat on our other side. All right, and if you need additional pins, add them now. So now we're gonna sew this to the neckline using our 1/2 inch seam, and we're gonna leave this folded pressed edge out of the way. All right, so now we're going to press under our placket here. All right, so we're going to press our placket here 1/2 inch. We're going to do both sides. And now we're going to fold our placket along this notch right here, right sides together, lining up our neckline there. We're going to leave this loose. Make sure you don't catch it in there. Should be looking like this. Let's repeat for the other side again. So we're going to fold this right sides together right there along the notch. Line up the neckline edge here. Keep the collar out of the way. And we want to stitch right along the stitching line we've already sewn. So now we'll turn out this corner here. Make sure we have a nice point here. We'll do the same on the other side. This is a good time to start making sure things are lining up along your center front. All right, I think we're gonna be okay. Now we're gonna press our placket again. So we're gonna press right along this notch down here. See that notch right there? And we're gonna catch our pocket in here. And we're looking for a nice even space here. All right, so now that we have our placket pinned, we're gonna mark a line so we can stitch from the right side so our top stitch thread is on the top, right? So let's mark a line. We're gonna make it 1 3/8 inch parallel to the fold edge, or 3.5 centimeters. You wanna make sure that your pocket bag is caught inside your placket here, and everything's looking nice and parallel. And we're going to stitch from the right side along that line there. And I'm just feeling for that fold, making sure that I'm catching my facing underneath. This is where my pocket bag ends, so I'm trying to prevent getting like a little divot there. Let's make sure everything looks good. We've caught our whole edge. And now we can add our second row of top stitching parallel to this one at 1/4 inch or 6 millimeters. All right, now the last little stitch we're gonna do is right here along the edge at about 1/8 of an inch away, or 3 millimeters. There we go. Now you're gonna repeat for your other placket. Let's finish this collar. So the first thing we're gonna do is we're gonna really carefully snip this raw edge right here. And I'm gonna lift up this edge here because I have a little bit of an overlap. Snip my collar. I'm gonna angle it over here. Like this. Get rid of any of these threads that fall off right now. And we want this to poke up into that neckline there. So let's repeat for the other side. All right, this is a good time to add a label if you like. So I'll put that on my center notch there. I'm gonna tack it in place. All right, so now we're gonna pin our collar and cover up our stitch line here. So here's my stitch line. We want the fold of this collar to go just past it. So we want to make sure that when we stitch this down, we're catching the collar and we're covering up this seam. So one thing I think that is sometimes helpful is I'll put a row of parallel pins along the collar here to make sure that I don't pull too much on the collar and I also don't get any torquing in the collar. So I just put a little row, you know, like 1.5 inches away from the edge here, just something to stabilize it. And then I will start in the middle here, make sure that that notch still lines up in the right spot that I can see right here on the collar. And then I sort of bounce back and forth between each side and make sure that I'm getting it all pinned the way I want it to without any torquing. So I'm going to start here. And usually my first couple, especially near the neck, I'm not going to perfectly pin that yet. I wait till the end since they're sort of the trickiest spots. I just get them in place so that there's something there. So now I can find my shoulder notch and put that notch there. You can see I sort of straighten out the collar. You know, I don't let it sit curved like this when I'm doing it. If I was focusing right here, I'm going to get it nice and flat in that little spot there. So I've got sort of all the landmarks pinned. You can see this one lifting up here. So let's go back. And now we're going to check our neckline and see how it's looking here. Okay, this is looking pretty good. We can take these pins out just so that there's less in our way. And now we're going to stitch this folded edge down. Now remember where this fold edge is in relation to that seam, because on the front here, what's going to show is just this little bit right here. It's not really going to show back here because the collar is going to be folded over it. So we're really just concerned about how it looks right here, and we're sewing on the collar side of things. So I like to look and see, okay, how far is that fold past my seam right here, so that I sort of know how far away from the fold to sew. All right, here we go. Put on your top stitch length. So now sometimes I'll see a little bit of rippling right here, and this could be because maybe the collar's a little bit longer, maybe your presser foot tension is really tight and pushing down on the fabric and pushing the top layer toward you. And if you start seeing that happen, lift your presser foot up, relieve that tension there, and if you have something like an awl or something else like that, you can sort of push against the sewing to sort of ease it in there. And then once you get to a pin, you'll know that you've corrected that slack. And I'm always straightening this out, making sure that whatever I'm sewing is perpendicular to the needle. See, right here's a good example of how it looks a little bit loose right here. So I'm gonna just push down and push toward the needle a little bit, just to make sure it stays on track. And so here's this raw edge right here. I always pick this up, pull it, make sure it goes exactly where I want it. There we go. See how we did? All right, there's our collar, and look at that. I underestimated how much the collar would cover up the stitching, so that's a really nice bonus there. Nice job. We are onto the sleeves. We're going to work on our inner sleeves first, and we're going to finish this little extension right here. And now we're going to press it 1/2 inch to the wrong side. Now we're going to stitch this down with 1 row of top stitching, and I'm going to feel for the line of the finished edge there and use my 1/2 inch seam allowance on my plate to know that I'm getting right there. All right, on the sleeve extension right here, we're gonna also fold this back, but we don't need to finish it first because this eventually will get turned twice. So we're gonna press it first and stitch it. All right, and we'll just stitch right along that raw edge. This will get turned again. With our inner sleeve and our outer sleeve, we're now going to sew the seam here, and we're gonna line this up at the 1/2 inch seam line. We're going to sew our seam at our regular stitch length. And we're going to stop when we get to the notch here of our extension. So right here. And now we're going to finish this long edge. I'm going to tack my serger thread here into the seam here on the outer sleeve, so I can hide it. And now we're going to press this seam toward the outer sleeve, and that's going to fold this extension here with the raw edge 1 more time, just like this, like that. And we're going to finish sewing this extension here. So we're going to pull this one out of the way, and we're going to sew from the cut edge at the cuff here up, across, and down. And when you're sewing this, you want to think about the width of the stitching, because when we top stitch our outer sleeve, we want it to match that same width so it looks seamless. I have this pulled out of the way. I'm going to go up this folded edge first. Go across the top, and remember, this is where you want to think about that width. And then back down this other side. And now we're going to top stitch our sleeve, and we're going to start from the top and go all the way down here and meet up with our stitching here at the extension. All right, so if you are using a heavier top stitch thread, this is a really great place if you don't want to have a visible back stitch where you're ending here. What you can do is meet up with where you want this to end. Land my needle right in that corner. And now you're going to raise your needle up, pull out your work, leave a really long tail, and then from the back side, we're going to pull on this bobbin thread here, and it's going to pull the top thread to the back, just a little loop. And then I usually grab my awl or a pin or a seam ripper, it doesn't really matter. And we're going to grab that loop, which is, I know, very hard for you to see here, right here. And then I'll pull it to the back here. I'm going to hand tie this off. My top stitch thread isn't very thick, but sometimes when I'm doing really thick top stitch threads, back stitches can be problematic anyway, but this will hide that kind of really chunky looking back stitch. All right, and then I try and keep these tails out of the way for the rest of my sewing. And then later on, I will use a hand sewing needle and bury these tails, a little shorter, into the seam here. So I'll show you that really quick. My 2 strands here, and I will just go in where they're coming out. Make sure none of my needle is showing on the right side, and I stay inside the seam allowance here. Pull my needle out, and then I give this a little bit of a tug, and then cut it flush. And then now I have a very seamless looking line of stitching here with no visible back stitch. So now we'll repeat this for our other row. So hopefully it will line up. And there we go. We have our finished vent here with top stitching. Looks really nice. Here we go. We're getting so close to having a jacket, so let's attach our sleeves. We're going to add 2 rows of easing stitches between the notches here along the cap of the sleeve. We're going to keep those 2 rows inside the seam allowance, and we want our stitch length to be between 3 and 4. If you have a heavier weight fabric, I'd go longer. We're going to pull on our bobbin stitches. When I'm sliding my stitches, I try not to rub this edge here so that it doesn't get too frayed. So I just try to stay away from it. A lot of the sleeve cap is on a bias cut, so it won't fray too badly. So we're just looking for a nice even tension. We don't really want any gathers or tucks. You can see that the sleeve is now starting to have this formation, and that's what we're going for. And then I'll swap to the other side. Okay, let's see how it lines up to the armhole. So here we have our armhole. And we're gonna line up this notch at the cap here to the cap notch that's right back here on the back yoke. It'll be just past your shoulder seam here. So we'll put a pin there. We'll put a pin here. We'll line up our underarm to our side seam. We'll do our other one. And now we kind of take a look and see how much, and that looks pretty good right there, a little tight. So we can let go of some of those. And we don't want this to stretch right here, so be really gentle, don't pull on it because it's very stretchy right there. And we're not really adding any of this ease past those notches in your armhole, so we can pin those too. We're just focused on this little area here, and you can see we've gathered it too much. We can let it out a little bit. Make sure you're also lining it up on the seam line. Don't think about how it lines up on the raw edge. The raw edge won't match. Let's see how this side is. We'll most likely need to let some of these out. We'll line it up to our underarm notches here. Let's see how that looks. Looks pretty good. We want most of our easing at the cap. All right, and we're going to sew this with a 1/2 inch seam. Your regular stitch length, so make sure you take it off of the easing stitch. And now we'll press the seam toward the sleeve. Now we're going to finish the seam with your chosen seam finish, and we're going to top stitch it with the seam pressed toward the sleeve. All right, here's how it's looking. Okay, now it's time to assemble our jacket. So we're going to line up our underarm of our sleeve and our side seam, and we're going to sew this one long seam here of the underarm and the side seam. And we're going to sew this with our seam allowance, finish the edge, and top stitching the seam will be optional. It'll be pretty tricky to get inside your sleeve for top stitching, so you might opt for no top stitching, 1 row, 2 rows, whatever works for you. I'm going to try 1 row of top stitching. I'm going to press the seam toward the back. And I think I'm just going to do it 1/4 of an inch or 6 millimeters from the seam, just to sort of hold down my seam allowance. Now we're getting to the fun part here. If you have particularly thick seams, I know this sounds like it might not work, but using a hammer to mash those seams down makes a huge difference, especially on denim and seam junctures and thicknesses. Just give it a try. And I would protect your fabric with a piece of fabric first. I would protect your project with a piece of fabric when you do that. So we just have to worry about the couple of inches in front of the needle. It's going to get harder and harder. We can do it. My hands are really working hard right now. They're pulling apart the opening here very firmly. I get it nice and situated, hold it so. All right, we're almost there. All right, and then we just kind of ooch out like this. And there we go. We've got a nice top stitched underarm side seam. All right, time to add our cuffs to our sleeves. We're going to press one long edge of our cuff. In the instructions, we press the uninterfaced edge and then we sew from the outside of the sleeve to the inside. I'm going to do the exact same steps, but we're going to do them the other way. I find that if you're a beginner putting on cuffs, this is a little bit easier and you won't have to worry about catching that cuff, and all of your good stitching is done on the right side and nothing to worry about on the underside. So I'm going to press under the long edge that was interfaced on the cuff. Both my sides of my cuff are interfaced, but this brighter white is the outer cuff here. So we're going to press a 1/2 inch along this edge. And now we're going to put our cuff right sides together and we're going to sew across the ends. Now it's kind of a good idea to sort of check if your cuffs are the same, and you can see mine aren't, so I need to adjust that. Okay, we're back on track. Now, if you want to sew these the way I'm planning on doing it, you want your sleeve to be right side out. This will be, especially if you don't have a free arm like I don't, I have a flat table here where the bed of my machine meets my table. This I find to be a little bit easier to maneuver. So we're going to turn our cuff right side out and get our points nice and crisp. And now we're going to press our cuff so that we have a nice even width here all the way down. There's those points. Make sure it's nice and straight the best you can. All right, so the next thing you want to make sure of is that this right here, this little extension opening is flush down here. You want these two to be exactly the same size. This way your cuff won't be at a jog from one side to the other when it overlaps and buttons close. So make sure that your extension here is flush. And now with your sleeve right side out, you're going to stick your cuff with the inner cuff to the inner sleeve, and the inner cuff is this unfolded edge in this case. Now when I'm lining up the ends here, one thing I think about is we really want this to, when we turn it right side out and we tuck this in here, we want this to be able to wrap around this edge. Now this edge here with this extension with the overlocked edge, this one's a little thinner. The other side, however, is a little thicker. So when I'm doing this one over here, see how this one's a little thicker, and you might be doing a denim jean jacket and that might be even thicker. So the way I look at this here, this seam of this cuff right here, that essentially should be centered on the thickness here. Now I know this seems kind of specific, but it helps a little bit when you're thinking about how this has to wrap around right here. And you need the space for this thickness to fit in here and your cuff to wrap around. If this is lined up so close to the edge out here, what'll happen is your cuff will kind of blump over like this. So what you want to do is line up this edge of the extension here almost all the way up, but not quite. You want to leave a little bit of space, that little red there, to wrap around this thickness here. Now if you have a pretty thin cuff, like if you're doing a shirt, you don't have to worry about this as much if it's a pretty thin fabric. But when you're doing something with thickness, that helps a lot give you the space to keep your cuff kind of lined up and on track. All right, so line up this raw edge to the inside of your sleeve. And now let's sew it on with a 1/2-inch seam. And you've made sure that your cuff is the same width across, right? These two are the same width. You've made sure your extension is the same length. Everything should line up as long as you use the same seam allowance at the beginning as you do at the end. So I'm going to peel this back so I don't accidentally catch it. I'm just getting all of these threads and fabric pieces to the raw edge here. Make sure your cuff doesn't ooch off of the end here. If you need to push it on toward the needle to kind of keep it on track, do so. All right, and here we are at the end. Make sure you started and stopped with your same seam allowance. And we're going to double check again that everything is on track. We have our seam there, that works. All right, now we're going to turn our cuff out there. Maybe make sure no threads or anything are showing here. And now we're going to turn our sleeve inside out. There we go, just like this. And so now all we need to do is tuck in this raw edge and stitch around the perimeter. And we won't have to worry about catching in this edge since it's already done. We just need to sew our top stitch on the right side. So first, let's trim some threads here. First, I will get this kind of started, and then I come back and check things. And another hint, just like I told you with the collar, one thing I like to do is flatten out the cuff and put a line of pins parallel down the middle. And this helps, especially if cuffs that don't have a seam right here, and even ones that do, it's nice to have this sort of stop to pull against, and then that way you won't over pull while you're trying to line up the edge and get a crooked cuff, you know, going along the length there. So here we have our little stop, and now we can pin this shut, and it can be close quarters in there. Sometimes I'll peel it back like this. Make sure everything looks good. And get this raw edge in here. Now if you have any messy back stitches here, you can see I have a few loops here. Try and clean this up a little bit because they sort of give you a hard time when we're at this phase. Clean up that back stitch. And then I use an awl or something similar to really push this in here and sink it into the cuff. All right, so let's look at our first pin here. With this edge here, we're gonna sink that in there. I will sometimes pull the cuff and kind of over rotate it toward the center. You can see I even have this little bit of a looseness there. And that's just so that I don't end up pushing in it, falling off the edge and kind of lumping off the end. All right, so now we're ready to stitch our cuff. Now, where I like to start and stop, especially if you're doing some sort of heavy top stitch thread, is I will start at the underarm seam, so this seam right here, and I hide my back tack right there. I don't put it at the end because it's a little risky. If you want to adjust your cuff later and you have your back tack here and you have to take out that back tack, the fabric gets a little tired and it can get a little messy there. So I put the back tack here, and I don't even back tack on my my first start. I only back tuck at the end. And now all we need to do is stitch down this folded edge here. And I'll use my awl to sort of push the fabric, so again, so that this fabric doesn't kind of push off the end here of the cuff. And I'll sink this in here. And just go slow. If your thread matches with your seaming, it's going to look a lot nicer than using the contrast. All right, and then make sure everything's nice and flat. All right, and we're approaching our starting point, so I'm going to clip this thread and make sure underneath it doesn't look too messy either. We don't like to immortalize any of that. And there we go, just like that. And then that's our only back tack right there. Looks nice and clean. And that looks really good. And so you can see on the back here, I didn't land on the cuff. You can see here's my stitch line. It's kind of off the cuff, sometimes in the ditch, and that's okay. No one's going to see that. They're going to see the nice side. All right, let's trim these threads here. And now repeat for your other cuff. Time for our waistbands. We have our back band and we have our 2 front bands. We've interfaced half along the length of each of these, and I've added some extra interfacing to mine since I have a lighter weight fabric. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to sew our side seams. So match your interfaced edges up, and we're going to sew this at a 1/2 inch seam. Now let's trim this down to a 1/4 inch or 6 millimeters. Let's press this seam open. So again, I'm going to be sewing this like I did the sleeve cuffs. So this is the perfect time and the last time where you're going to make sure that your center front matches in length here. This is pretty important because this is a pretty well-constructed jacket. It's not like you can just let the hem out if the center fronts don't match. So we're going to make sure that our whole placket here is lined up and the same length, and you know exactly where you're going to be sewing your band to. And we're going to start with our jacket wrong side up. We're going to press our waistband wrong sides together first, and then we're going to open it back up and we're going to press the interfaced edge down 1/2 inch along the entire length. And now we're going to sew this right sides together. Sew the ends. We'll turn our waistband right side out, get our corners nice. And if you need to press your waistband again, do so now. And we're going to start with our jacket wrong side up, the inside of our waistband to the inside of our jacket. And we're going to do the exact same thing we did with the cuff. It'll probably be a little easier since we have a larger space to work with this time. Line up your seams, line up your seams. And again, I'm going to let that line up pretty good and give myself some space to wrap around the edge. All right, and now let's check. And remember, you want to start and end with the same seam allowance so that your center front still lines up. You should be catching your pocket bag in this seam. I'm going to bring my front over here and make sure that I get the same width waistband. All right, and now we'll triple check. Since it's harder to fix it later, make sure our band is the same. It's pretty close. Okay, and now we get to do the fun part. We're going to push our seam allowance down into the waistband, clean up anything we see, and then we'll edge stitch it closed. And give it a good tug here. And we can press it as well. And remember, you want to really push that in there, get it nice and sunk down. Be very firm with it. You're the boss. All right, so again, I like to start my back stitch or my start and stop somewhere that's not at this center front edge here. So we'll start maybe at the side seam or maybe the back seam. I think I'm gonna do a side seam here. We're gonna go all the way around the perimeter. We're gonna close this up. We don't have to worry about the underside, and then we'll have finished our waistband. Make sure you get rid of these messy back stitches if they're showing. You can even remove them once you've closed your waistband. Keep the weight of your jacket on your table. Don't let it pull. There we go. It looks really nice. There's our inside, so our pocket got enclosed there. Nice job. We have one more piece left. We're gonna do our side tabs for the jean jacket. First thing we're gonna do is fold this right sides together. This is my notched edge right here. And we're going to sew across the short end here and along the length. I'm going to trim the seam allowances in half, and then we'll turn this right side out. All right, we press, And now we're going to top stitch the perimeter 1/8 or 3 millimeters away from the edge. Here we go. And you'll need the mark on your front band here to find the placement for your side tab. You're going to put the seam edge down and lay your raw edge right up to that mark. Make sure it's nice and parallel to your waistband here. We're going to sew it on with a 1/2 inch seam. We're going to trim this seam allowance close to the stitch line. We're going to fold it back over our seam. We're going to top stitch 3/8 inch away from our fold here, or our seam, which is about 1 centimeter. We're going to enclose that trimmed edge. And there you go. You're ready for your buttons and buttonholes or your snaps. Your last step will be to add your buttons, buttonholes, or snaps, and you'll have 1 here at your yoke, 4 in your center section here, and 1 along the waistband. You're going to put 1 on your tab, but 2 buttons so that you can adjust the waist, and then 1 on each cuff. There's placement markings on the pattern pieces as a guide. I wish you luck. Enjoy your Glover jean jacket, and I hope I get to see yours. Thanks for sewing with me.